right, let's bring in now Democratic strategist and Fox News contributor Leslie Marshall. Leslie, thanks for joining us. I'm sure you heard what Miranda just said. And again, we can all disagree. We disagree on politics. We can disagree on news stories. But as Miranda says, it is a pretty disturbing. It is a disturbing trend, a disturbing new factor, isn't it, in our politics, when tech companies, which have all this power, can literally prevent people from gaining access to actually what turns out to be a really important story.
Well, I've said before, you know, on this network, Fox News as well, on my radio show, you know, I'm a Democratic strategist and I'm a talk host, so I opine about the facts. But years back, I was a journalist in which I reported the facts. And in order to report the facts, you have to report the facts regardless of your political leaning. And that means people on the right, you got to hear and let the American people hear the facts about January 6th, or people on the left, Hunter Biden, Hillary Clinton, on the right, the Trump and their children. I mean, the list goes on. I think it's wrong for tech companies to prevent information. I think it's right for them to prevent misinformation if people are Holocaust deniers, for example, or if they're putting about information that is harmful, especially during this pandemic, like injecting bleach or maybe taking medication that physicians and scientists
but they're going way beyond that, aren't
you.
they? They're going way beyond. And by the way, they, for example, they blocked last year any stories. They took down stories that suggested perhaps that China, the virus had leaked from a lab, saying that was misinformation. We now know again that wasn't misinformation. There's a very real possibility it happened. So they're going way beyond, like, you know, just taking down information that may be harmful. They're taking down information that may be politically inconvenient.
But it's also up to them. They're not covered by the First Amendment. They're private companies. And part of the responsibility and the onus is on we, the consumer, the people that are eating up the Twitters and the Facebooks and the Instagrams and the Snapchat. We have created this monster. We are feeding the beast by being consumers of this. Nobody should be getting their news from blogs, and nobody should be getting their news from Twitter and from Facebook. Certainly not with a pandemic or anything political, in my opinion.
Les, we've got to take a quick break. The Omicron variant is surging through the United States, and a number of leaders have responded with predictable alarm, closing colleges, imposing new vaccine mandates and enforcing stricter testing and mask requirements, despite there being little evidence so far of any significant increase in hospitalizations or deaths due to the variant. One Democratic leader seems to have broken with all of this and has decided he's had enough. That was Colorado's Democratic governor, Jared Polis. Is he right? Is this an indication, perhaps, that even Democrats now have decided that it's time to declare an end to the pandemic and find a way to live with it and move on? Well, let's ask our panel, Leslie Marshall and Miranda Devine. Miranda, if I come to you first. Miranda, the evidence is that this new variant, while very widespread and it's surging everywhere, is very mild. There's only been one death ascribed to it, I think, so far. Is it time maybe that we just get used to this now and accept that this is becoming endemic and find a way to get on with living our lives?
Look, the early indications are that Omicron is very contagious but mild. And if that's the case, that's good news. I mean, it could end up being a sort of a natural immunity booster. And Dr. Marty McCary from Johns Hopkins is calling it the Omicold. And we know from the last 2 years that overreacting to the virus and lockdowns and destroying small businesses and destroying the lives, particularly of young people, has really adverse consequences. And I think that we should really take a deep breath, stop counting and obsessing about cases, and look at hospitalisation and deaths. And if that is not drastically going up, then let particularly young people live their lives. And if older people or scared people want to lock themselves down for Christmas, they're perfectly free to do that. If they want to go and have 100 new boosters, go ahead, do it. But don't force your choices on the rest of the country.
Leslie, it was striking there listening to Jared Polis, the Democratic governor of Colorado, saying, look, essentially enough is enough. We really, as Miranda says, we do need to move on. You know, Joe Biden, again, did come into office a year ago promising to shut down the virus. It does look as though he's kind of trapped now, trying to keep to that promise by literally, like, eliminating the virus, zero COVID. Isn't it time, actually, that we've just got to accept that it is now endemic, that we're going to have to live with this for many, many years, and we can't have our lives completely dictated by this and transform the way we live. We just have to find a way to live with it.
Spoken so eloquently by a non-healthcare worker, but I am married to a physician, so I hear about these stories each and every day. Here in California, that's exactly what we did, and we led the nation in lowest COVID deaths at one time, and that when everybody else was surging, we had it under control because of some of these mandates. Here's the problem. If you don't want to wear a mask, and you don't want to social distance, and you don't want to have a vaccine, or you don't want the second shot or the booster or any future shots, then please stay out of the ER and don't clog up the medical system and burden the healthcare workers, because that's what it comes down to. You say, Miranda, talk about deaths in ICU. I hear you, but you know what? There's a whole other area in medicine, and that's called emergency room, and we have our emergency rooms that are overburdened when we have a spike. We're seeing it in New York City right now, for example.
Leslie, we've got to go. More bad news on inflation this week as wholesale prices increased by 9.6% in November from last year. That's a record high since the government began collecting these data 11 years ago. But the Biden administration is relentless in their efforts to blame anything but their own policies for this rise in prices. Listen to this.
The President, the Secretary of Agriculture have both spoken to what we've seen as the greed of meat conglomerates. You could call it corporate greed, sure. You could call it jacking up prices during a pandemic.
So let's see if I've got this right. We had low inflation for the last 25 years, but suddenly, only under Joe Biden, companies have got greedy, especially meat companies apparently are now to blame for inflation. Well, let's take this up with our panel. Miranda, let me start with you, if I may. First of all, they told us inflation wasn't happening. Then they said it was happening, but it would be transitory. And now it's apparently all the fault of greedy companies. It's very clear from polling numbers that we saw this week. Fox Business had a poll this week showing that actually voters very much blame the administration. Voters aren't buying it, are they?
No, they're not. I mean, almost two-thirds of voters are blaming Joe Biden's policies, and with good reason. What's really driving inflation is energy prices up 30%, rents, worker shortages. All of these are, you know, an artificial construct. And to be blaming corporate greed is just another desperate excuse by the White House, not facing up to the fact that not only are their policies to blame, but they're making them worse because they want to pour more gasoline on the fire, more money into the mix.
Leslie, again, as I said, we had low inflation for the last 20, 25 years. At some points, inflation pretty well at zero. But why are we suddenly asked to believe then that companies have become greedy and are pushing up prices to make profits since Joe Biden became president?
Actually, the corporations have been pushing up prices since the pandemic, and it's not necessarily corporate greed, and it's certainly not the Biden administration, nor was it the Trump administration. This pandemic did not occur in the past 25 years or 25 years ago when we had practically zero. And what we also had is the Treasury Department and the Feds not thinking that it was going to be as bad as it seems it will be, saying it was transitory. And now, obviously, we're seeing the Feds become more aggressive, and that seems to be a good thing, at least on Wall Street, as we've seen stocks rally and rise based on that. The bottom line is this pandemic has created inflation, not just here in the United States, but in the world. So if it's Joe Biden's policies creating inflation in the United States, how did he do that in the UK and other nations that have inflation
Leslie,
higher to ours?
Leslie, I've got to pick you up on that. It's much, much higher in the US than in any other country. The UK raised interest rates this week, is true, but it has inflation nothing like it's high. And isn't it at least partly because of course, supply chain issues are partly to blame, but this administration came in and poured a huge amount of money onto the economy, ignored the inflationary pressures that were going on, and by the way, now wants to put even more money into the economy and more debt into the federal government.
I am not in the Biden administration. I'm not an economist, but 24 Nobel Prize-winning economists have said no, and I'm actually going to take their expertise and go with that.
You can always bring out Nobel Prize-winning economists. I think Ronald Reagan said that you know, you could lay all the economists together around the world and they still wouldn't reach a conclusion. But anyway, we've got to take another break. Grading students based on merit is now apparently racist. Some California school districts have banned the use of D and F grades, stating that the failing marks disproportionately affect minority and low-income students. Instead, high schoolers can retake tests and redo homework in a system apparently called competency-based learning, which of course is exactly the opposite of what it claims to be. Critics say the move will only help to dumb down education. So let's ask our panel. Leslie, let me start with you. I think you have kids in school in California. Do you really think it's the right way to go, that kids should not be allowed to get low grades?
Here in California and throughout the country, Latino and African American children have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. They've had more deaths in their families. They don't have the help at home with homework. They've been uprooted. And children, and I can attest, my children are 13 and 14, and they're both in 8th grade. My children went through things I had never seen with the pandemic, in school, out of school, working at home, even though I was able to help them. There are parents out there that can afford tutors for their children. That is not the case with the majority of these students in these communities and in these schools. So what they're not trying to teach kids that, you can't fail. What they're trying to see is where are your weaknesses and how can we help you?